My daughter-in-law sprang to her feet, walked straight over to my wife, and shouted in her face, "Get out of here right now." That clacking sound is so annoying. That was how she opened her own birthday party. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a glass of water, some snacks, get comfortable, and remember the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they just chose wrong. Leave a comment with the number 1, so we can continue the story, and hit subscribe, you're going to enjoy this one. It was a summer evening in Manhattan. The glow of chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling reflected off sparkling crystal glasses. The laughter and conversations of the upper class filled the room without pause. Ethan, my son, stood beside his wife. Both of them wore expensive, custom-designed outfits. They smiled brightly as they welcomed influential figures from the business world. My wife, Megan, and I were seated at a table tucked away in a corner. My wife had recently endured a long illness. Her legs had grown much weaker. Every step required the support of an old wooden cane. As soft orchestral music played in the background, Megan wanted to use the restroom. Holding on to the edge of the table, she slowly rose to her feet. Her wooden cane tapped against the marble floor, producing a faint clacking sound. That sound felt completely out of place in such a luxurious setting. Mia was standing nearby. She immediately turned around. Her eyes swept over Megan's outdated coat before stopping on the cane. Her expression hardened. Without a moment's hesitation, she hurried over. She spoke loudly enough for 3 nearby tables to hear. She said my mother's presence was ruining the group photos with important business partners. She treated the presence of her mother-in-law as an inconvenience. And she did not stop there. In a harsh tone, she ordered my wife to leave. It was a level of disrespect that could not be tolerated. I did not look at Mia. I turned and looked at Ethan. My son stood there. He glanced at his watch and then looked away. He did not defend his mother at all. He stepped closer and lowered his voice, but his irritation was unmistakable. He told his mother to listen to Mia. He said she did not fit the sophisticated atmosphere of the event. He advised us to take a taxi home early so we would not ruin everyone's good time. My wife was stunned, tears welling in her eyes. Her hand trembled as she gripped the cane tightly. The wrinkles on her face tightened with hurt. Yet she remained silent and did not argue. Megan had always been that way, spending her entire life enduring hardship for her children. The ingratitude of the son we had raised cut deeply into the dignity of both of us. I remained seated. I did not get angry and I did not raise my voice. I simply stayed silent. The silence of a man who had already traveled through nearly all of his life. I looked directly into the eyes of my son and my daughter-in-law. I wanted them to know what was about to happen to them right now. In my mind, a major decision had already been made. I slowly rose to my feet and adjusted the collar of my suit jacket. I walked over to Megan and took hold of her frail arm. I supported her by the elbow. She leaned her full weight against me. The clacking of her wooden cane echoed once again, slow and solitary, as we made our way toward the exit. The entire banquet hall suddenly fell silent. Every eye turned toward the 2 elderly people being quietly shown the door. Mia smiled faintly, the look of triumph obvious on her carefully made-up face. Ethan let out a sigh of relief. Perhaps he thought the problem had finally been solved. But they were wrong. My silence always came with a very expensive price. From the central table, Arthur rose to his feet. He was the chairman of the largest investment firm in Manhattan, and also the man Ethan had practically begged for 3 months just to secure a meeting with. Arthur did not say a single word. He slowly buttoned his suit jacket and stepped away from the table. He did not look at Ethan, nor did he spare Mia a glance. He walked straight toward me. Behind him, 2 other billionaires from the banking industry's board of directors stood up at the same time. They silently followed him. That powerful silence seemed to drain all the air from the room. The entire ballroom froze. The smile on Mia's lips stiffened. Ethan's face turned pale. He stammered as he called Arthur's name, but the chairman never looked back. They walked alongside my wife and me, protecting the dignity of the true founders. Arthur's black limousine was already waiting, with its engine running at the entrance. He personally opened the door for Megan. Only after my wife and I were comfortably seated in the back did Arthur look at me, give a slight nod, and signal for the car to leave. Throughout the ride home, the interior of the vehicle remained completely silent. Megan stared out the window, watching the city lights drift by. She did not cry, but her hands were clasped together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. I took hold of my wife's icy hand. I knew her heart was broken because of the son she had brought into this world. Ethan's coldness was a fatal knife wound in a mother's heart. I watched the first streaks of rain begin to gather on the window. In the darkness, I smiled calmly. Ethan and Mia believed they had climbed to the very top of high society. They were proud of their $1 million apartment and their rapidly growing company. But those two arrogant children did not know one truth. The foundation beneath their feet had been built entirely by my own hands. When the limousine stopped in front of our old house, I helped Megan out. I pulled out my phone and called the family's private attorney. My voice was calm but sharp in the darkness. I instructed him to prepare every document related to the secret trust fund. It was time for the ungrateful to learn what it felt like to lose the support they had always taken for granted. Early the very next morning, a confidential letter was delivered directly to Mia's office, carrying a terrifying secret capable of destroying her entire career overnight. The morning sunlight streamed through the window of our old house. On my desk sat the trust fund documents that my attorney had delivered earlier that morning. I flipped through the pages one by one. Ethan and Mia's names appeared under the beneficiaries section, but ultimate control still belonged to me. For many years I had deliberately chosen to stay in the background. I wanted my son to become independent. I wanted him to understand the value of hard work. But that generosity had created an ungrateful monster. The luxurious Manhattan apartment that Mia proudly showed off on social media had actually been purchased with money from this fund. Even her fast-growing media company would have gone bankrupt 3 years ago if it had not been for the financial backing I provided. My son and his wife were living inside an illusion of their own making. They believed their success came entirely from their own talent. They looked at elderly, modest people like us with contempt, treating us as a burden. I took a sip of hot tea. The bitter taste spread through my throat, mirroring the bitterness in my heart. No matter how magnificent a house may appear from the outside, if its foundation is built on sand, even a gentle breeze can make it sway. People are no different. When they forget their roots, when they forget those who sweated and sacrificed to pave the road before them, their collapse becomes only a matter of time. At that moment, photos from the previous night's party were beginning to flood online news outlets. Mia posted a lengthy article boasting about an upcoming international project that was about to be signed. She carefully edited out every trace of my wife and me. Ethan shared the post as well, adding words of praise for his wife. They were intoxicated by a false spotlight. What they did not know was that 3 of their most important business partners had just withdrawn their names from the guest list for the upcoming signing ceremony. My dignity could endure an insult, but the dignity of my old friends could not. I closed the file. The covers struck together with a dry sound. Megan entered the room, still holding her wooden cane with trembling hands. She looked at me with sad but understanding eyes. She did not ask me to forgive our son. She simply sat down in the chair across from me. The silence shared by 2 elderly spouses inside that large room carried an overwhelming weight. It was the silence that comes before a great storm. At that moment, the phone on my desk began to vibrate. The screen displayed my attorney's number. I answered immediately. The lawyer's voice lacked its usual calmness. He informed me that he had just uncovered an extremely unusual move from Mia's family. Mia and her parents had been secretly carrying out something outrageous behind our backs. They were targeting Megan, my loyal wife, with a scheme so cruel that it was beyond forgiveness. The attorney's voice on the phone was quiet, but every word that reached my ears felt like a stream of ice water. My in-laws were trying to gain access to the central hospital where Megan had undergone medical evaluations the previous month. They were using money and connections to bribe an associate department chief. Their goal was to alter my wife's medical records. They wanted to portray her as someone suffering from severe dementia, no longer capable of sound judgment. I kept the phone pressed to my ear. I did not interrupt, nor did I reveal so much as a sharp breath. I rose from my chair and walked to the window, looking out at the small yard where Megan was carefully watering her rose bushes. A woman who had spent her entire life being kind, who had never harmed even an ant, had now become the target of a hunt driven by the greed of her own son and daughter-in-law. If Megan were declared legally incompetent, control over the assets registered in her name within the trust would automatically pass to Ethan. That was why Mia wanted her mother-in-law pushed out of the party. She wanted to create the public impression that Megan was no longer mentally fit. Greed had blinded them. They did not just want money. They wanted to trample the dignity and the life of the woman who had brought one of them into this world. I ended the call. The phone felt cold in my hand. I returned to my desk and stared at a family photograph taken 10 years earlier. Back then, Ethan had been a good boy who would run to hug his mother whenever he came home from school. Now the greed of the woman beside him had transformed him into a heartless accomplice. When the moral foundation of a person has rotted away, they become capable of the most disgusting acts without feeling a trace of guilt. They wanted to test the strength of the foundation. Very well. I would show them the weight of a structure built over 40 years. I opened a secure drawer and removed a small voice recorder. It was the device my trusted assistant had used to capture an entire conversation between Mia's father and the associate department chief at a discreet cafe. Every piece of evidence, every amount of money discussed, had been recorded with undeniable clarity. I gripped the recorder tightly in my palm. The father's voice, sharp and chillingly calm, echoed through the empty room. I did not send the evidence to the police immediately. Nor did I call Ethan to warn him. A true hunter always waits until the prey reaches the peak of its arrogance. I knew that 3 days later Mia's company would be hosting the signing ceremony for its international resort project. That would be the place where all of their glory was displayed, and it would also be the place I had chosen to bring everything to an end. What I did not expect was that very same evening Ethan would drive to our old house on his own, carrying a sinister contract in his hands. The engine of a luxury car came to a stop in front of our old house. The car door opened, and Ethan stepped inside wearing a perfectly tailored suit, though the exhaustion on his face was impossible to hide. He did not look at his mother, who was sitting beside the tea table knitting. Instead, he walked straight toward me and placed a stack of documents on the table. In the tone of a busy executive, he explained that the papers were an authorization agreement for asset management, supposedly to make investing in a new project more efficient. He claimed that because his mother's health had declined recently and her memory had become unreliable, it would be better for the entire family if the assets were placed under his control. I looked at the documents on the table and then raised my eyes to my son. He checked his watch twice within a single minute. To him, sitting in this old house and speaking with his parents was nothing more than a waste of valuable time. He was eager to return to Mia's glamorous world. I did not touch the pen he offered me. I simply remained silent. My silence lasted so long that Ethan began to grow uneasy. He started rambling about the future, about the enormous profits the international resort project would supposedly generate. I stood up and walked over to Megan. I placed a hand on my wife's frail shoulder and felt the faint tremble that ran through her body as she listened to the lies coming from our son. Then I turned and looked directly into Ethan's eyes. I told him to go home for now because I needed time to review everything carefully. Ethan was clearly displeased, but faced with my firm refusal, he reluctantly gathered the documents and stormed back to his car. Once the sound of the engine had completely faded into the distance, I turned on my computer. On social media, Mia had just posted a new photograph. It showed the corner of her luxurious office along with an arrogant caption about financial freedom and self-made success. Praise poured in from her followers like rain. They admired her as the embodiment of achievement. I read the words with complete calm. Not a single ripple disturbed my thoughts. They had soared so high because of the money flowing from my trust fund, and they genuinely believed they had reached the stars. I shut down the computer. Then I picked up my phone and called the largest partner involved in the international resort project, the owner of a multinational construction corporation. I did not use dramatic threats or grand speeches. I simply provided one brief piece of information regarding the true ownership structure of Ethan's company. I informed him who actually held ultimate authority behind the capital that guaranteed the entire operation. Every legal document had now been returned to its proper place. I was ready for the final act. The blueprint for the downfall of the arrogant had been completed. Tomorrow's international signing ceremony would be where I appeared to reclaim everything that rightfully belonged to me. What I could never have anticipated was that Mia had already prepared another vicious move to block my path. The event hall of a 5-star hotel in the heart of the city was flooded with flashing cameras. A grand display bearing the name of the International Resort Project signing ceremony stood prominently at the main entrance. Ethan and Mia occupied the center of the hall. Dressed in their finest attire, holding glasses of wine, they smiled constantly as they posed for photographs with reporters. Confidence and arrogance were written across their faces. I entered through a side entrance. I had chosen a simple black suit, no flower on the lapel, no badge of distinction. Calmly, I walked to the last row of seats and quietly sat down. Not a single camera lens turned toward me. Not a single security officer bowed in greeting. To them, I was merely an old man who had wandered into the world of the wealthy. From a distance, Mia spotted me. Her expression shifted briefly before she quickly signaled for two large security guards to approach my seat. She walked over and positioned herself so that reporters could not see us. Lowering her voice, she spoke with a sharp, threatening tone. She said this was an international-level event and that people without official business or membership credentials should leave immediately to avoid ruining the image of the occasion. She even implied that I had come here to tarnish her and Ethan's reputation because of what had happened at her birthday party. I did not stand up. I did not become angry. I simply looked directly into the eyes of my arrogant daughter-in-law and offered a calm smile. I told her she should take another careful look at the list of people who actually owned this project. Mia let out a contemptuous snort. Then she turned away and ordered the security guards to remove me. Just as the two guards were about to place their hands on my shoulders, the ceremony's opening music filled the hall. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage, his voice booming through the powerful sound system. He announced that the signing ceremony was officially beginning. Ethan and the representative of the multinational construction corporation walked together onto the stage of honor. The entire audience erupted into applause. The MC began delivering the opening remarks. He respectfully introduced the largest shareholder, the person who held ultimate decision-making authority through 60% ownership of the entire resort project. This individual was also the true owner of the investment fund that financially backed Ethan and Mia's company. The entire hall held its breath, waiting to hear the name of a powerful figure from the financial world. Ethan proudly adjusted his tie, preparing himself to welcome the billionaire he had admired for so long. When the MC announced my name through the microphone, every spotlight in the hall immediately swept across the audience before stopping directly on the seat where I was sitting. Mia and Ethan froze where they stood, their faces twisted in shock as a horrifying truth shattered everything they thought they knew. It was a reality far beyond anything they had ever imagined. I rose to my feet beneath the spotlight. Slowly I walked toward the stage. The sound of my leather shoes striking the wooden floor echoed with a dull rhythm. The entire hall fell silent. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on me, the old man, who only a minute earlier had been dismissed as someone who did not belong there. Ethan stood frozen in place. The color had completely drained from his face. His hands trembled uncontrollably. The pen he had intended to use for the signing slipped from his fingers and rolled across the glass table. Mia stood with her mouth hanging open, her eyes wide with fear. I stepped up to the podium. I did not look at my son or my daughter-in-law. Instead, I faced the board members and international investors seated before me. I did not need to shout into the microphone. With the calm, seasoned voice of a man who had lived through decades of experience, I began presenting the facts one by one. I publicly disclosed the documents showing how Mia's company had manipulated financial records to conceal bad debt. I presented evidence, proving that funds had been withdrawn from my trust without the approval of its founder. With every statement I made, the murmurs among the investors grew louder. They exchanged uneasy glances before turning toward Ethan with anger in their eyes. The representative of the multinational construction corporation immediately rose from his seat. He withdrew the contract that was moments away from being signed. Panic overtook Mia. She rushed toward me, attempting to seize the microphone. Stammering, she claimed that I was lying, that I was a cruel father trying to destroy his own children. I remained silent and took a single step backward. I had no need to argue with her. My attorney stepped onto the stage and placed another file on the table. It contained recorded evidence of the scheme to falsify Megan's medical records in an attempt to seize her assets. At that moment, the entire cruel truth was laid bare before the public. Outrage swept through the hall. Reporters fired off photographs without pause. Flash after flash illuminated Mia's pale face. I turned toward Ethan and announced that I was withdrawing 100% of the investment capital backing the company, effective immediately. The carpet beneath the feet of the arrogant had been completely pulled away. The collapse happened instantly. International partners turned their backs and walked out. The signing ceremony became the biggest embarrassment of the year. Mia crumpled onto the stage floor, expensive makeup streaking down her face with tears of humiliation. Ethan looked at me, his lips trembling as though he wanted to beg for mercy, but I had already turned away and begun walking toward the exit. The hollow foundation beneath them had finally given way. Yet the real punishment awaiting the two ungrateful souls was only the beginning of a far more devastating chain of tragedies than they could ever have imagined. If you've followed the story all the way to this point, then perhaps you've found it interesting. Please help us with one small and quick favor: like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you've made it this far, and tell me your prediction for how the story will end to see if you're right. Many people watch without doing that, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. The media storm swept across the city overnight. Ethan and Mia's names flooded newspapers and news sites, not as successful young entrepreneurs but as financial fraudsters and ungrateful children. Their downfall unfolded with terrifying speed. Once the financial backing from my trust fund was withdrawn, Mia's company immediately plunged into insolvency. The banks did not sit by and watch. They swiftly froze every account and seized the remaining assets belonging to the two of them. Just 2 days after the signing ceremony, their luxurious Manhattan apartment was sealed off. I stood across the street and watched quietly. Ethan and Mia stood on the sidewalk in the early season cold. Beside them were 5 cardboard boxes containing the few clothes and personal belongings they had left. Mia was no longer dressed in designer labels. She wore a simple coat. Her hair was disheveled and she constantly tapped numbers into her phone. She called the people who had once praised her at exclusive social gatherings, but all she received were unanswered calls and abrupt hang-ups. Society's indifference toward those who no longer have money can be brutal. When you are at the top, everyone wants to be your friend. When you fall, they treat you like a contagious disease. Ethan sat hunched over on a cardboard box. His face was buried in his hands and his shoulders shook uncontrollably. He had lost everything: his reputation, his career, his wealth, and his self-respect. He glanced at Mia and then stared into empty space. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone. In its place was the misery of a child stripped of every layer of protection. They were finally experiencing what it meant to have no home and no money, just as they had once been willing to cast an elderly mother aside. I turned away without a trace of sympathy. A foundation built upon lies and ingratitude can end only one way. They would have to learn how to rise from the ruins they had created themselves. Over the next 2 weeks, nobody knew where Ethan and Mia had gone. They disappeared completely from Manhattan's elite circles, but I knew that material punishment alone was never enough for a child who had lost his conscience. The true torment would come when they realized they had lost the most valuable thing of all. Then, on a late afternoon, as the largest thunderstorm of the year poured over the city, frantic knocking echoed through the front door of our old house. It brought with it a heartbreaking sight, one that left Megan unable to hold back her tears. The rain hammered relentlessly against the metal roof of our old house. Thunder and wind howled outside the windows. I sat in my familiar wooden chair, holding a cup of tea that had long since begun to cool. Megan sat across from me, slowly knitting a sweater for the coming winter. The peaceful atmosphere inside our home felt completely detached from the chaos raging in the outside world. Then suddenly a frantic pounding echoed through the house. The knocking was forceful, mixed with muffled sobs coming from the other side of the wooden door. Megan flinched. Her frail hands froze in place. I gently rested my hand on my wife's shoulder, signaling for her to remain seated. Slowly I rose from my chair and walked toward the living room window. Pulling back the curtain slightly, I looked through the rain-streaked glass. Ethan and Mia were kneeling on the ground in the middle of the yard. Their clothes were soaked through, clinging tightly to their bodies. Mia bore no trace of the arrogance she once carried. She cried uncontrollably while lowering her forehead to the concrete again and again. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her face. Ethan knelt beside her, gripping the windowsill with both hands as he called out for his mother through sobs. He apologized over and over. He begged his parents to open the door and give them a chance to survive. They had nowhere left to go. No money, no home, no one willing to help them. Megan saw the scene through the glass. Her hands began trembling violently. Tears rolled down cheeks marked by age and hardship. She started to rise from her chair. She wanted to open the door. She wanted to embrace her son. But I stepped beside her and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. I shook my head. The silence between us carried an enormous weight. I turned back toward the window and looked directly at my son, kneeling beneath the storm. I did not hate him. What I felt was a profound sadness. People often discover regret only after they have lost everything. The remorse displayed beneath that curtain of rain did not come from understanding what they had done to a mother. It came from needing shelter from the storm their own choices had created. I did not unlock the door. I remained motionless behind the glass, allowing their cries to be swallowed by the relentless rain. The words of a father echoed quietly through my mind, calm yet sharp as a blade. Some foundations once cracked beyond repair are not rebuilt. All that remains is to stand back and watch them collapse. It was too late for salvation. That night the two broken figures eventually staggered away through the storm in complete despair. By the time dawn arrived, the old house stood nearly empty. Megan and I had packed our belongings the night before. We stepped outside and climbed into the car, ready to begin an entirely new chapter of our lives. Behind us, we left one final legacy, one that would make Manhattan's entire upper class bow their heads in respect. The sound of ocean waves gently rolled onto the white sandy shore. Breezes carrying the salty scent of the sea drifted across the porch. 3 months after that stormy night, Megan and I had moved to a peaceful coastal town. This morning, warm sunlight flooded the small yard. My wife sat in a wicker chair, the peaceful smile having finally returned to her face. Her hands no longer trembled as they once had. She was flipping through photographs of the charitable foundation that bore her name. Before leaving Manhattan, I used every remaining dollar from the trust fund to establish the Megan Foundation. It is an organization dedicated to providing support and medical care for elderly people living alone, for fathers and mothers abandoned by their children. I wanted to transform my family's pain into something meaningful for others. Members of high society and many former business partners generously contributed to the foundation. They respected us not because of wealth, but because of the moral legacy we had chosen to leave behind. I walked over and placed a warm cup of tea into Megan's hands. Together we looked out toward the distant sea. Money can buy a seat at the most luxurious banquet table, but it can never buy respect or love within a family. Too many young people today spend their lives chasing status and recognition. They view the aging and slowing of their parents as a burden. What they fail to realize is that those quiet figures standing in the shadows were the ones who laid the very first bricks in the foundation of their lives. If you see your parents as a burden, pause for a moment. That silent presence may be the very foundation keeping your life from collapsing. A house that loses its moral foundation will one day crumble no matter how tall it stands. Ethan and Mia paid an enormous price to learn that lesson. Today they are working long, difficult days on a farm in a remote rural area, earning just enough to survive. I have not given them another cent. It is the only way for them to rebuild the part of themselves they lost. Thank you for staying with Dad's real-life revenge until the end of this story. If this story gave you something to think about, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps stories about respect and kindness reach even more people. I took Megan's hand in mine. Together we had weathered every storm, and now it was finally time to enjoy true peace. In the end, the greatest happiness in life is growing old with someone whose shoulder you can still lean on and carrying a heart that is calm, content, and free of regret.